So good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our Genesis group, a home for morality, freedom, and family. It is my great pleasure to welcome my dear friend and prolific speaker, Mr. William Gairdner, to our group tonight. William is a fantastic author and a valuable independent researcher for many years, and his insights have been invaluable to the pursuit of truth and the advance and preservation of the conservative civil society. We are privileged to have William with us tonight, and we look forward to hearing his thought-provoking lecture on democracy and modern slavery. So, William, thank you very much for all that you do, and the stage is all yours.
Thank you very much. So I think we're going to be about an hour tonight, not counting what I just did. So a little shorter than some of our lectures. This section is on modern slavery. And first, when I first mentioned that phrase to people, they kind of go, "What are you talking about?" So here's what I'm talking about. In what was, and by the way, that's in contrast to, the ancient forms, which we discussed in my previous lectures. So in what was widely considered a monstrous aberration of so-called normal slavery, the modern transatlantic slave trade began operation for, and this is what was an aberration, purely commercial motives, no others. Just commercialize these people and sell them. Very unusual form of slavery compared to the ancient type. And that began, as I say, for purely commercial motives shortly after the end of European serfdom. But it was not as if the Americas were virgin ground. When Columbus arrived in the New World in 1492, he discovered that slavery, along with cannibalism and torture, was already widely practiced by many tribes that he ran across. For example, the local Taino tribes, the Arawak, and the Carib tribes. Of course, we named the area down there the Caribbean, after the Carib Indians. Many American and Canadian native tribes also, such as the Tonkawa of Texas and the Kwakiutl tribe of British Columbia, were also slaveholders, or cannibals, or both. At the time of white conquest, up to 15% of the Kwakiutl were domestic slaves to their own powerful chiefs. On their arrival in Mexico, white Europeans were horrified to discover, I guess what you say was a protein-hungry Aztec civilization built on slavery, human sacrifice, and I can't actually believe this figure, but I got it out of the book by a very good anthropologist, an estimated cannibalism of up to 250,000 slaves every year. I mean, it's just not credible. But let's just say there were a couple of 100,000 of these people getting eaten at some point. At any rate, the modern commercial slave trade, begun by the Portuguese in 1442 and dominated by the British by the mid-18th century, was outlawed by the same British everywhere they operated about a century later, although it has never completely vanished from the world. By the time this so-called peculiar institution, as it was known, began, it was common for unlucky citizens of a wide array of Mediterranean, African, and European nations to end up in a slave market somewhere. Slaves were by then collected by many methods other than war, which, as I say, was one of the chief methods in ancient slavery, including kidnapping, stealing from owners, and the big one was breeding, which became a large source of income for southern U.S. slaveholders. 4 in 10 fertile female slaves in the southern United States produced a child every single year of their fertility. And of course, the child was sold as a slave. President Thomas Jefferson, believe it or not, once sought a, quote, breeding woman, unquote, for his, quote, young and able Negro men, unquote. And he bragged about the homebred increase in the value of his own crop of slaves. Even James Madison, the prime mover of the U.S. Constitution and a symbol of human freedom himself, owned slaves. He was in deep despair about this, of course, but not so deep that he freed them. Before he died in 1836, he sold 16 of his slaves at a profit of $6,000, which was a lot of money back in the day, because to free them would have impoverished his widow. Now we're getting into see the moral binds which the whole system of slavery brings upon the owners. And this is one reason why so many critics of slavery talk about the owners of slaves being themselves morally enslaved to the system that they're operating. Modern slaves were obtained by piracy, of course, by hostage taking, or simply by purchase. And children were often sold into slavery by their own parents, as they sometimes still are in India, Asia, and parts of Africa. A philosophical paradox for modern liberal theorists, of course, who seem so naive in this context, to me anyway, is that some people actually sold themselves into slavery to settle their debts. In ancient times, many even sold themselves to Roman citizens so they would become Romans themselves when they were freed. Sometimes whole cities or peoples, such as the Mariandynians, I think that's how you pronounce it, of Attica in 560 BC, would sell themselves by contract into slavery to a neighboring city in exchange for what? For protection against their enemies in war. The question this raises is, can we freely make ourselves unfree? Now, this is a textbook question for all political philosophers because free choice or consent gives moral sanction to political behavior. And if we agree that a man can freely sell himself into slavery, then we must also implicitly agree that an entire nation can consent to be unfree under, let's say, a dictatorship, which legitimizes mass political slavery. Freedom theorists have a vested interest in denying this right and even contort themselves to do so. Later in this book, I'm talking about the Trouble with Democracy book, which is the foundation for this talk. We will see how the great English liberal theorist John Stuart Mill wrestled with this very same ancient question. At any rate, at slavery's peak in the early 19th century, when it was practiced by just about every modern nation, most of the west coast of Africa, which had always had an internal slave trade, became a veritable network of slave trading tribes and nations, not that they called them nations then, but kind of tribal nations, territorially speaking, with coastal fishing villages converted to slave depots and black African chiefs orchestrating its success. Now, I'll just comment here that I have some, especially one dear black friend I've known for 50 years. He found me actually when he was a high school boy, and he was a fatherless black fellow, and so many young men, black men in Canada, live in fatherless homes. It's striking. And he asked me if I would coach him, and I did. And eventually he made him good enough that I got him a university scholarship and sent him off to the University of Colorado for 4 years and then helped him get his first job and all that kind of stuff. He's very successful now. But often when he talks to me about, racism and white guilt and all the rest of it, and I say, what about black guilt? He said, what do you mean? I said, well, you guys made them slaves. We just bought them. I said, it's very hard to find a white man who ever made a black man a slave. it was mostly black men who did that. You know, they went into the interior of Africa and they raided and plundered all these poor people in these villages, killed as many of them as they could that they didn't think they could sell, raped a lot of their women, I don't know, put them all in chains and marched them to the coast and sold them to white slave traders who bought them, but they bought them as slaves. They didn't make them slaves themselves. Of course, they didn't do anything to undo it either. I'm just saying. And so my dear black friend, it just goes quiet when I mention that argument. Anyway, at slavery's peak in the 19th century, as I say, when it was practiced by just about every modern nation, most of the west coast of Africa was like that. The transatlantic trade was a huge bonus to who? To Africans themselves. Some of the, I'm quoting now, the most inveterate and cunning slave operators were detribalized blacks, mulattoes. A mulatto is someone who's half and half, not 100% black, mixed race, we would say today, and often freedmen or the sons of former slaves who got into the racket to make some money, unquote. These people acted as brokers for inland African kings, as they called themselves. A favorite African method of harvesting slaves was to feign war, fake it in other words, set a whole sleeping village on fire, and then corral the fleeing inhabitants and sell them into slavery. White people too fell into the slavery net. Most white people don't realize that. Barbary Coast pirates worked the Italian and the Spanish coast in the 17th century, and using a form of fundamentalist Islam as a pretext for conversion, captured unwary white Christians for many generations and sold them into slavery in black and Moroccan and Arab countries. At one time, the city of Algiers, and this is all from history, I didn't make it up, held as many as 25,000 Christian white people as slaves. Meanwhile, the tribal territories of East Africa were, quote, like a vast hunting preserve, unquote, because Arab slavers worked closely with black chiefs to hunt down human quarry as if they were game or like animals, unquote. By the time this came to a head in the mid-1800s, close to 15% of the entire transatlantic trade in slaves was sold in the American colonies, and the rest in Central and South America. By the time of the U.S. Civil War, slaves represented about $2 billion in gold and roughly 35% of the entire capital assets of the southern United States. Compensation by government for freeing them was therefore out of the question. They simply couldn't afford it. Excuse me. As for Canada the Good, slavery, how could it be? School children in Canada learn only that Canada served as a kind of holy land for persecuted American slaves who arrived by way of the Underground Railroad, as it was called. This has created an unjustified belief in Canadian moral superiority as compared to Americans. Canadians are always surprised when I tell them about this. Excuse me. The truth is that many native tribes, especially in the Northwest, native Indian tribes, that is, practiced the slavery of both their enemies and of their own people. And this was far more extensive than has until recently been believed. The myth of the noble savage, as I say, has been taking a beating. They weren't that noble. Canada's great white leaders were not so nice either. A little booklet entitled Slavery and Freedom in Niagara. Now, Niagara is part of the province I live in, which is the center of which is Niagara Falls, which you probably heard about. Wonderful waterfalls. And it soon tells the story. With some surprise, we learned that of an estimated 4,000 blacks living in what were called the Canadian British colonies in 1780, about 1,800 of them were slaves. Canada's first anti-slavery law, was passed on July 9th, 1793, but it did not exactly outlaw the practice of slavery. It was called, rather, an act to prevent the future introduction of slaves, unquote. In other words, slavery would remain legal, although no more slaves could be imported. Canada's last slave to be sold at auction was a man named Emmanuel Allen, and he was sold on August 23rd, 1797. In pioneer Canada, slave owning, quote, was widespread among the emerging political and social elites as well, unquote. Men such as Peter Russell and Matthew Elliott, who sat on the Legislative Council of Upper Canada, which is now called Ontario, again, the province I live in, owned dozens of slaves. And most Canadians are just shocked when you tell them this. We don't teach it in the schools. You have to go digging for the truth. Most sought to protect their so-called right to own slaves. Now you're getting serious about moral and legal quandaries here, by arguing that a slave was legally purchased property and that the right to own property was basic in all free societies. Courts that were able to take away legally owned slaves, the argument went, could also take away land, your home, and your company, and tyranny would reign. Many settlers were American loyalists, as we used to call them. These were people who were loyal to the King of England, King George III at the time. And when the Americans had their Declaration of Independence from England and said they wanted to go out alone as democratic states, these loyalists fled to Canada. No, we're loyal to the King. We're British through and through. We're going up to Canada. Now, many of those who came, they came only because the government then had promised them cheap land only on the condition that they clear the land. Like, you can have 1,000 acres up there in Canada, up here in Canada, they said, but you have to clear the land and make it arable for crops and all that. And so they said, yeah, that's a deal. So they purchased slaves, and they took their slaves to Canada specifically for that purpose. But then they said, who's going to compensate us for our slaves if we have to free them and we lose the benefit of slave labor? These farmers asked. Having lured us to Canada, they said, is the government now going to ruin us? So you can see the moral dilemmas and contradictions that these people got into over slavery. An irony of the history of slavery in Canada, and again, we don't teach this in the schools here, and you'll just get a shocked reaction if you tell Canadians even today, is that many individual American states, including Delaware, Michigan, Rhode Island, and Connecticut, banned slavery outright 20 years before Canada prohibited, and only prohibited, the future importation of slaves. As far as I know, Canada has never passed a law specifically banning slavery. That was covered by the British ban throughout the British Empire, so I guess they figured that they didn't have to. The result of this was that the state of Michigan became a, quote, an instant haven for slaves escaping from Upper Canada, unquote. Of course, the Canadian slave owners complained bitterly to their government, imploring what we called the lieutenant governor here to stop what was in effect had become a reverse underground railroad from Canada to America, but he refused. Now I want to talk about the connection of all this with our own times. There is a widespread conceit that the most inhumane slave labor regimes were those of the ancients, or even the peculiar institution of the Atlantic slave trade, and that we moderns could never stoop to such a thing. But the truth is that chattel slavery still exists in many parts of the world, in countries such as Mauritania and the Sudan. And what is called open bonded labor, which is a inheritable exchange of labor for money, for loans, much of it by children, is endured by millions of slaves in the Asian subcontinent. We'll lend you $1,000, but you have to give us your 2 children as slaves until you pay the loan off, that sort of thing. A 1996 article in the Ottawa Times newspaper complained that, quote, persecution of Christians continues the most serious human rights crisis in the world today, unquote. And that in the Sudan, quote, many Christian boys are forced into Islamic camps while others are sold as slaves, unquote. Shakil Pathan of the Pakistan's Human Rights Commission has protested that bonded laborers in his country are, quote, bought and sold like animals, unquote. A recent book about this called Disposable People claims that more than 27 million people remain in this kind of violent economic bondage today. On a fiery hot June day in 1996, 2 newspaper reporters from the Baltimore Sun embarked on a kind of, okay, let's see for ourselves mission deep into the Sudan. And they wrote, this is the day we're going to try to buy a slave, unquote. And they bought 2 from a trader who said that since 1991, he had freed 473 slaves, mostly women and children, for a set fee or price of 5 cows, or the cash equivalent of $500 for each slave, and returned them to their families. What a nice guy. In short, anti-slavery societies around the free world are still very busy. Reports also frequently surface about the widespread selling of very young girls into forced prostitution, which is to say into sex slavery. In many parts of Asia, much of it to satisfy the kinky sexual appetites of shiploads of educated tourists from the rich liberal democracies. Yes, the liberal democracies where freedom is supposed to be the catchword. Just after I wrote these words, this was in 1993, Canada's Globe and Mail newspaper ran a week-long series on international child slavery for sex and bonded labor. It claimed that there are 15 million such slaves in, get this, democratic India alone. On April 14th in the year 2000, the National Post cited a CIA report that claimed, quote, Canada is a hub for the sexual exploitation of women, unquote. Certain big city newspapers in the hip western parts of the country discreetly advertise specialty travel trips that cruise cheerfully away and off to Asian ports filled with sex customers, including heterosexual and homosexual pedophiles, eager to prowl for very young children who work as sex slaves for local owner pimps in the countries that they arrive at. In May 1997, tourist leaders from 60 nations met, quote, to combat child prostitution flourishing in major Asian destinations, and they vowed there would be no safe haven anywhere for sex tourists, unquote, adding that the worldwide growth in tourism has spawned prostitution and sex tours. Now, this is the knowing purchase of slave labor by enlightened, educated moderns, most of them proud of their liberal attitudes. Invariably, said Julian Fantino, then chief of police in London, Ontario, which is about 100 kilometers from where I live, he said, it's tourists from our countries, the sophisticated, advanced countries, who go to these places for no other reason than to sexually victimize children. So my conclusion is it's not as if we have left slavery behind in our times. And by the way, when my wonderful son-in-law was about to marry my daughter, we had dinner together, and I was asking him about his ambitions. He's a great lawyer, super prosecutor. And he said he really wanted to go to Southeast Asia and try to do legal work to shut down some of this slave trade, sex slave trade. And I said to him, I said, Paul, I'm soon going to be your father-in-law, but I'm going to start protecting you from yourself right now. And he looks at me like, what are you talking about? I said, I'm just guessing, I said, but I would say that sex slavery has existed in Southeast Asia for at least 1,000 years. It's probably infiltrated with gang bosses from top to bottom who have lots of machine guns and knives and poisons and so on to take care of ambitious young Western idealists like you in a flash. Like, I don't think you would survive a job like that if you were successful. And I think if you tried it, you would be, but not for very long. So I implore you not to do it. And so he didn't. And we still have him as a wonderful son-in-law. Anyway, now I want to start a little section called The 20th Century Was the Worst. No one today can imagine that slavery could ever make a comeback. Yet it was a mere 60 years ago, well, 70 years ago now, that one of the most liberal regimes in Europe moved in the space of a decade to institutionalize the mass enslavement, forced labor, and genocide of Jews, Slavs, and other so-called inferior races, quote unquote. An even more sobering realization is that the world record for slavery belongs to neither the ancients nor the transatlantic commercial slave trade, but to the ideological manipulators of our own time. I shall explain. Seldom in history has slave labor been so widespread, cruel, and deadly as in the various concentration camps, where? Of the educated West. In what amounts to a kind of mass pathology, these camps were filled not with the captives of wars between nations, but with the captives of national governments waging internal ideological warfare against huge populations of their own citizens, usually in the name of justice and equality. Professor R.J. Rummel, and I know, Harry, you've probably read this book or seen it, one of the few experts in the subject of worldwide political cruelty, he writes in his book, Death by Government, that in a mere 70 years, the slave labor systems created by Lenin, built up under Stalin, and made infamous far too late by Alexander Solzhenitsyn's wonderful book, The Gulag Archipelago, quote, likely chewed up almost 40 million lives, well over twice as many as probably died in some 400 years of the African slave trade from capture to sale in an Arab, Oriental, or New World market, unquote.
William, I think that what you're describing is absolutely correct, but I think there might be a small exception, and that's the Muslim slavery, which also responsible for up to even 100 million casualties.
I'm not going to be surprised. I don't know much about it. Perhaps you can tell us more about that now or later if you wish. I didn't really.
I will have to have my resources to be able to make the point. I saw that in a few different lectures and books, but it was really bad for 700 years. Sorry, 1,400 years. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not surprised.
Mm-hmm.
Hitler's camps had the ultimate slave logo, iron stamped, over every doomsday gate in his camps. In German, it said, Arbeit macht frei, which in German means work will make you free. Oh, man, what a cynical statement. His regime proceeded to use 12 million slave laborers of whom, by the way, over 1 million are still living. Recently, 21 of those surviving slaves went to court for compensation and won compensation. When I say recently, this book was published in the year 2000, thereabouts, so 2001, I can't remember. So it's a little fewer than I'm mentioning here. But to this sobering picture, we need to add the labor and torture camps of the North Vietnamese, the Cambodians, the North Koreans, and the Chinese, among others. And thus we arrive at the disturbing conclusion that the 20th century was the most slavery-infested century in human history. Rummel's book is a testimony to the grotesque evils of modern government power through the exercise of what he defines as democide. That's from the Greek demos, meaning people, which is the intentional killing and genocide of people by their own governments. In short, government is bad for your health. He concludes that in the first 88 years of the 20th century, at least 100, this is appalling and hard to believe, but he documents it all, that at least 169 million human beings, and conceivably as many as 360 million, but he can't prove the upper figure, documented, were liquidated. Astonishingly, fully 82% of these deaths were off the battlefield. They resulted from the outright slaughter and killing of full citizens by every imaginable means. From his wide-ranging comparative analysis, Rummel concludes cheerfully, but I believe erroneously, and my book, The Trouble with Democracy, explains why I differ with him on this, that the democracies of the world, he says, hardly ever enter into wars against each other, and they commit far less democide than the totalitarian states. Therefore, he argues, the democratic systems are better. But he fails, I think, to see how we can make a rigorous argument, startling though it may seem at first, that the totalitarian ideologies, plural, whether fascist, socialist, or communist, is itself an outgrowth of the logic of democratic theory in its unitary form, as opposed to its pluralistic or liberal form. Indeed, this has been characterized by some theorists as totalitarian democracy. And we think here of Talman, and I know you've been reading Talman's book or parts of it, which is titled The Origins of Totalitarian Democracy. That phrase alone is a shock to most people who've never thought about this. In a later chapter in my book, we explore in depth the road that leads from simple democratic enthusiasm to totalitarian democracy.
William, just a quick update, if I may. I remember, I hope I remember correctly, but I checked the webpage of the book Democide, and I think they updated the numbers to 262 million people who were murdered by their own governments, not in war.
For whom we have, for which we have evidence, you mean?
Yes.
It's shocking. It's shocking. Even if you take this evidential number is shocking enough, but he adds a lot more numbers to that, which he can't quite prove, but he's pretty sure that they were true. Regardless, I mean, when I tell people these kinds of numbers, I just sit them down at a party and say, I'm curious to know, what do you think? How many people do you think? How many soldiers do you think died in the 20th century? I mean, people in uniform who were fighting each other in wars. How many do you think died? And they come up with a number, And then I asked them, how many citizens in the 20th century do you think were slaughtered by their own governments? First of all, they think the question is crazy. What do you mean? And I say, well, think about it, Maoism, communism, Nazism, Pol Pot, the whole business. See. And they take a guess, but they're nowhere close. They're never close to these numbers.
Yeah.
It's certainly, you have to sit down and actually think about this for a long time to let it sink in. So through pervasive control and so-called education, the unitary systems seek to force the people in the name of something called the general will. And I say in my book here, we will soon look at this concept as it was developed by Rousseau, which is one of my chapters down the road, into a single centrally controlled life and identity. And that is why this sort of politics is sometimes called identitarianism, a system in which everyone identifies with a single symbolic leader and ideology. By contrast, the pluralistic systems encourage a multiplicity of identities under a rule of law. Over time, the unitary systems tend to crumble from the inside because of the excessive physical oppression required for their maintenance, the increasingly obvious ideological skewing required to defend their theoretical purity, and most of all, the gross distortions of normal life that all of this entails. I remember when we were kids, there was a joke that my friends who escaped from communism told me. I said, "What was it like over there?" And he said, "They pretend to pay us and we pretend to work." So the whole thing was a sham, from top to bottom. And the former Soviet evil empire, I suppose, was the best case in point of all this. But it happened in so many places. It's mind-boggling. The pluralistic varieties, by contrast, crumble from a sustained effort to accommodate with official neutrality, as they call it, a multitude of conflicting value systems, resulting in populations with no firm identity. Canada is one of these today. Every week in the newspaper, I see somebody agonizing over what the Canadian identity is. What is our identity anyway? And they all take a shot at describing it, but obviously no one knows, because the traditional forms of identity, which came from a long history of religion, philosophy, and moral tradition and habit and custom, have been put to the side. I have liberal friends who at least give me a laugh when I tell them their minds are so open, their brains are falling out. So we have a bit of a laugh over that, but it's true. The modern liberal collectivist state, for example, proudly pretends to be simply, here's the phrase, a procedural republic, unquote, neutral regarding the moral ends of society. Boy, if that isn't a disaster, I don't know what is. But this is an enormously debilitating hoax, as we shall see in this book. For policy justifications, however, both of these systems rely on the idea of democracy as the supreme will of the people, and yet it is the unitary form that vastly accelerates what I call the democratic algorithm, so to speak. And it brings the whole regime it justifies to an end the most rapidly. This democratic logic advanced with terrifying speed in the few years of the French Revolution, from the first noble proclamations about the sovereignty of the people to the last drops of blood. Its second disastrous and pitiable conclusion came with the collectivist systems of the 20th century. Pluralistic systems dissolve at a slower rate, and they tend to break up from internal dissension and often secession, countries trying to break up politically and form parts of the original country into new countries. There's a movement like this in the USA where a professor I've been in touch with published a book about, he's trying to divide the USA into 5 different countries to reflect their regional identities and disparities. I say good luck. I don't think it's going to happen, but I'm just saying these movements are underway, and they have been in many countries. And I mean, look at Israel. It's terrible what's going on there, and it's all about this kind of thing. And in Canada, we have the problem of Quebec. I'm a fluently French-speaking fellow myself. I love French culture, food, and literature, and all the rest of it. But Quebec has been, excuse my expression, they've been a pain in the ass to Canada ever since Canada was formed, always wanting special favors and usually getting them, quite different from all the other provinces. You know why? It's because they have enough of a population. They always threaten to vote as a bloc if they don't get what they want. And so they usually get what they want because Canada bends everything to provide it for them. So as I say, this process has been at work in Quebec, Yugoslavia, Scotland, Ireland, the former Czechoslovakia, and now Italy and the United States. The irony is that the pluralistic systems have been promoted to discourage the unitary type, but they powerfully encourage local identity in their individual parts. They thus fall victim to their own philosophy. Look at multiculturalism. You know, I know for a fact from Statistics Canada, which is a very honest and solid department of our government, maybe one of the only ones, that about 25 years ago, Canada had what they call 6 ethnic enclaves. These are parts of the country where people of the same ethnicity gather together as if they were governing themselves in their own country. And today, because of multicultural policy, the government tells us we have over 265 ethnic enclaves in Canada. Now, these are people who simply don't agree with each other on a whole lot of things. They get along peaceably for now, but they're always pushing for their own laws, their own regulations, and their own special treatment, which is a huge departure from the kind of unity which Canada was hoping for when it was put together. So as I say,
that answers the question of the new identity of Canada. 265 how did you call it? Enclaves?
They call them enclaves or enclaves. Yes, enclaves.
Enclaves, yes, of different minorities fighting for each other on the control of government, I suppose.
Yeah, they want favors mostly. They don't control the government, but they certainly control a lot of the voting. So the people in a democratic system who want their vote, they tend to want to give them what they want so they can get the vote. That's how it works. You know, so in democratic systems, politicians are whores for votes. Generally speaking, it's a very unusual politician who will say, no, stop. I'm not going to do what you ask for. That would ruin the unity of our country. And of course, I debate these people all the time. They're talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, and all this nonsense, you know. I said, listen, I said, you can have some diversity in a unified system, but you can't derive unity from diversity. And the more you go in this direction of more diversity, the less unity you're going to have. Seems pretty obvious to me, and it's becoming obvious on the political front as well. Although we in this country, and I'm sure a lot of other places in Europe too, are rushing into a confrontation with the ludicrousness of a philosophy which promises every social group in the country their own identity and to protect that and to give them privileges according to it. So you're talking about the breakdown of nationalism, and we have a prime minister in Canada who brags openly that Canada, he says, I'm quoting, is the world's first post-national state, unquote. He's proud of it. He thinks it's great. And so I'm saying to myself,
what did you say? Post what?
He said Canada is the world's first post-national state, meaning we're not a nation anymore. We're post-national. We welcome everybody. All immigrants are welcome, no matter where they come from. We don't care about their identity, their language they speak, their religion, or any of that stuff.
Especially uncompatible populations. They are most welcome, it seems.
It's unbelievable. And his father started this off. He was the more intelligent than his son, who's our current prime minister, who's not exactly a moron. He's very slick, smooth talking type, left liberal guy who's never really thought very deeply about anything. But his father said years ago, it doesn't matter where the immigrants come from. But I say that it does, because if you're going to call yourself a nation, it's probably true that you should have some kind of common religious ground, some kind of common political philosophy, some kind of common sense of language and literature, and so on. There's a lot of things, and I write about this sort of thing all the time, but it doesn't seem to have much effect. And we keep rushing headlong into this idea of the post-national liberal state, which basically has no definition. And of course, we see this in America with Biden. I mean, he's got something like 8 or 10,000 people a day rushing across the border. He has no idea who they are.
I have a question, William. Do you think that the population, the conservative white population of Canada, the US, and the West in general, the men especially, do they have what it takes to eventually say to this multiculturalism and this basically they're committing suicide and killing their own culture and everything that tells them to begin with to become a nation? Do you think they will be able to reverse it, or it's too late and the men are already gone?
Well, I think it's infiltrated the institutions. This came out of the kind of late Marxist thinking of a lot of thinkers who stopped talking about the war between economic classes, and they started talking about the cultural war between the oppressors and the oppressed, and so on. And this is being floated today under the banner of EDI, or equity, diversity, and inclusion. And in no time at all, I would say in 2 years merely, it has run rampant over every university in the country, in Canada and in the USA. Now we're seeing some reaction against it, but I think myself it's too little too late. These people see themselves, they self-actualize as do-gooders who think they're doing something noble in getting rid of things like ethnicity and nationality and, welcoming everybody, whatever. And so the key difference for me is this, and I have this argument all the time. We used to be a country based on merit, and the idea was you get where you're going to go on the basis of your own effort and your merit. Of course, you get help from your family, your friends, your institutions, your schools, your whatever, relatives if you can. But basically, it's a merit-based system. And that has changed incredibly radically in the last 5 or 10 years in my country, and changing now in the US and in parts of Europe, where we've gone to forced outcomes, legislated outcomes type of society. Okay, to simplify, the way we used to be was we talked about a start line. Think of life as a race. You're going from the start line to the finish line. Well, our philosophy was always the start line. Let's try to get everyone to the starting line together. That's why we invented the public school system, universities, and all the rest of it. We wanted as many citizens as possible to get to the same start line. Now, everybody knows that it's not possible for everybody. It's really tough for some people. People of very low IQ, for example, they really struggle to get to the same start line as people who are smarter, and people who are hardworking do better than people who are lazy. I mean, the whole business. But in terms of charitable feeling, some of the most wonderful things I've done in my life, which I guess aren't that many, is helping young fatherless Black men in Canada. They're all fatherless, but helping them. I'm their father. I become their father. They come to me and they ask me to coach them as a track and field coach. Well, I got pretty good at that, and I made them good enough that I could get them full scholarships to American universities. I mentioned this before, and off they go. But I tell them, I said, listen, I got you to the starting line, and I love doing it, and you worked hard to get here. But I tell you, I'm firing the gun now. The race is on, and you have to get to the finish line yourself. Well, that's what motivated countries like Canada and the US for hundreds of years, virtually. But all that has shifted recently, very quickly, into a finish line philosophy. Now the idea is, some of them just aren't going to get to that finish line as easily as others. We got to help them get there. So we're going to fib. We're going to tell lies about their grades in university. We're going to give them a pass when they don't deserve a pass. We'll give them an A when they only got a D in their course or whatever. That kind of thing. So-called affirmative action was developed to change our society from a start line society to a finish line society. So last week when I was down at the hospital. Anyway, we call this kind of thing affirmative action. It's actually a form of discrimination. And I don't use the word reverse discrimination because it's just plain discrimination against successful people who get bumped out by less successful people that the do-gooders and the bleeding hearts are trying to get to the finish line on time to win the race of life, whatever. So anyway, I said to my doctors last week when they said, we're going to do this invasive surgery for you next week. I said, listen, I said, I do not want an affirmative action doctor doing this surgery. Can you promise me that? Well, they just looked at me like this, like this guy actually dared to say that out loud, and he does not want an affirmative action doctor. I said, no.
They will say that you're a racist, right?
Yeah, they said, and I said, and you, I said, I submit, if you were having brain surgery, you wouldn't want an affirmative action doctor either. And you wouldn't want one for your wife's brain surgery or your child's brain surgery. Okay, if you have ulcers or a stomach ache or some general practice medicine, maybe you don't care and the guy's going to learn as he goes. But when it comes to something serious like the heart, I want the best. So they didn't say anything. But I got a note from my doctor later who sent me the names of the two surgeons who are going to look after me. And I researched them, and they're both incredibly accomplished men. And I know they're going to do a good job, so I could relax, But that's the world.
You don't have private medicine in Canada, right? Everything is nationalized.
Well, the way it works in Canada is we spend about, now it's probably 11% or 12% of GDP on medical care. About 7% of that is public and the rest is private. When I say private, it's things like, physiotherapy, diet counseling, stress management, all kinds of stuff that's really not full-on medical care, But the medical system in Canada is interesting. It's what you call a single-payer system. All the physicians have private practice. The government doesn't run their practice, but it controls what they're allowed to earn and what they're allowed to charge their patients. For example, if my family doctor decides to charge me double what I think everybody's being charged, actually, we don't get charged. I just walk into his office, he looks after me, and I go home. I never see a bill. His office sends the bill to the government, and the government sends the prescribed fee to his office. So say I gone to see him for the flu or something, they send a charge in for a visit to the doctor for the flu. The government sends back a check for $20 or $30 or whatever the list says it's worth, and that's what his office gets paid. But he's in business for himself, but he can only earn what the government allows him to earn. So in a sense, he's a slave to the government, and so are we. And most surgeons, like the people who are going to do me next week, they're on a rationing system. The hospital allows them, say, 5 hours a week to do surgeries or 6 hours a week because the government doesn't have enough money to allow every surgeon to do as much as they would like. I mean, these gentlemen might like to do 30 hours of surgery a week, but they're not allowed to do it. So in that sense,
they're not going to live, for example, for the US and prefer to work there so they can earn more?
Many of them do that. Many of them do that, and many of them don't. They have family here, they have kids here, parents here, relatives, a whole life here, the whole thing, And maybe some of them actually think it's a great system. They don't do poorly, they live well, but they're certainly not, most of them anyway, are not millionaires like you find in the US. A lot of doctors become very wealthy people, which you don't see much in Canada. So what kind of medical care have I had in the last few years? A lot of medical care, quite prompt and pretty good. I haven't been made to wait for too much. And these kind of systems are especially good if you have emergencies. It's really cynical, but I've had doctors who actually told me that they couldn't do the procedure that I wanted. So here's what you need to do. I'm on emergency duty at the hospital next Monday. I want you to come in and start yelling, fall on the floor, scream like you're in agony, and so on. He said, it's going to be so embarrassing for the hospital, they're going to rush out and grab you and put you on a bed and wheel you in, and you'll be able to see me quickly that way. Can you believe it? That's what he said. And I know friends who've done that. Oh God,
It's
can't stand
crazy.
the pain. So you get this kind of cynicism, and of course, Canadians are a bit stupid about it. They don't think, they don't read about it. And frankly, sorry for the advertising, but I wrote a whole chapter about this in my book called The Trouble with Canada. And again, in a book 20 years later called The Trouble with Canada Still, in which I discussed this business of this medical system. And by the way, people think America is all private. We spend 7% public, 3 or 4% private. They spend about 7% public as well. They have Medicare for the old and Medicaid for the poor, or vice versa. Maybe I got the names wrong, but they have socialized medicine for the poor and socialized medicine for the very old. Once you're over 65 in America, you get so-called free medical care. Of course, I tell my kids, nothing is free. It's prepaid. Nothing is free. Don't forget it. So, but the difference is in America, they spend another 7% on private care. So you can pay out of your pocket for anything you want to pay for yourself, which is, as I say, is banned. It's banned by law in Canada. Canada is the only country in the history of the world ever to have banned that kind of private medical care. Even the former Soviet Union never banned parallel private care. If you could afford a private clinic and find one, there was no law against it. They gave you lots of public medical care too.
Stefan Molyneux, he is the one who interviewed you originally, and that's how I learned about you. He had a cancer problem, and he is also Canadian, and he had to wait for so long. So eventually he decided to go to the States and undergo the procedures there to save his life. Otherwise, he would have to wait for half a year or something like that. It's
that's
insane.
what I would have. That's what I would have done too if I wasn't getting the care that I'm getting. I'm also a low-level cancer patient. I have a blood cancer called CLL, and it really alarmed me when I was told about this 25 years ago. And I went to a very good cancer doctor in Toronto, and I said, "I've done my research. I understand there's a test that you can do to see whether I have the gene mutation, which is a problem or not. Do you have that test here?" And he said, "We do." And I said, "Well, I'd like to access it. I'll pay for it out of my pocket, no problem." Well, he said, we can't do it for you. And I said, "Why?" He said, "You're not sick enough. If you were actually sick of this condition, we would do it." He said, "But we have to save it for those who are sicker than you." So I went to the Mayo Clinic in Minnesota. What a place. And I did the test there. Cost me about $2,000 or $3,000 for plane fare, hotel, and the medical treatment. And they told me what I wanted to know, which was that I was in a pretty good basket and my cancer was never going to really bother me. It's just a bit of difficulty if I get an infection or something like that. It's hard to get rid of it. But otherwise, it's not going to kill me. I said, "Well, I don't mind paying $2,000 or $3,000 to find that out, But it was impossible to get in Toronto. So this is called rationing by the queue. Now, queue means lineup, In Canada, you have to line up for medicine. I also had shoulder surgery because when I was living in Japan after the Olympics in 1964, I just wanted to stay there and find myself, as they say. I decided to study judo and practice judo, and the Canadian silver medalist in judo broke my arm. He basically pulled my arm right out of my body. It made a hell of a noise. It sounded like a shotgun going off as he pulled it out of joint. And I had to have, surgery on that. And so I called around in Toronto. I said, "I need shoulder surgery." You know what they said? They said, "Well, we have very few surgeons who actually deal with shoulders. They're more into hips and knees and backs and things like that. But there are a couple. Let's check those." So I found 2 surgeons who were competent shoulder surgeons, and one of them said, "I can see you in 18 months. See me for the first time for a consultation." And the other one said 2 years. So was I going to go to the U.S. to get this done? It's a problem. I go to the U.S. and get it done, and then I have a problem, and the Canadian doctor says, I'm not looking after you. You had it done in the U.S. You go back there if you got a problem, that kind of thing. Anyway, I used a bit of medical pull because I have some in this country still, and I managed to get my shoulder done in 6 months. But it's called rationing by the queue. It's very common in socialized medical systems. As I say, we are not really socialized. The government doesn't own the hospitals. It doesn't own the doctors. It just pays them a prescribed fee. So it's kind of a police state from a medical point of view. I don't know if you want to finish the rest of this. We're getting on now, but
please do. If you still have the energy.
Huh?
If you still have the energy, I would like for you to finish the episode.
Okay.
The chapter, I mean.
Yeah, so I will. I will.
Thank you.
So this part's called Slavery, the Non-Person, and Substitute Judgment. We have the notion that a slave in ancient times was some groveling creature abandoned to a master and without legal rights of any kind. So it comes as a surprise to learn that in both Greek and Roman law, slaves were carefully and minutely defined by special rights, special duties, and special punishments and immunities. In both countries, a slave could earn a wage. It was called a pecunium in Latin, or even sometimes a percentage of his own output. If thrifty, according to Cicero, a Roman domestic slave could usually buy freedom within 6 years, a possibility dangling like a shining jewel before the eyes of all slaves, which quelled revolt. It made revolt difficult because they knew they're going to be free. Why revolt and maybe get killed, But an indispensable part of slave systems everywhere was the legal definition of the slave as a non-person. This is important, what I'm getting at here, because it forms the core of my own theory about what's been happening in the Western democracies. A non-person, as someone who lived in a kind of legal void as a, quote, absolute foreigner, unquote, within the city. In Roman law, the most detailed and complete slave law, masters were forbidden to make contracts with slaves, and slaves could not legally own property, nor, however, could a slave, even a guilty one, be accused of theft, for there was no person there to do the stealing. Huh. Excuse me, I just lost my spot here. Okay, no person there to do the stealing. The missing property was therefore said to have been displaced. Now, such language was typical of the ideological skewing, as I call it, required to avoid admitting that a slave was a human being. And this extended to the fact that a slave's marriage was not recognized in law until he or she became free. And so it was also impossible to charge a slave with adultery, because adultery requires intent, and intent can only be formed by a human being. Even after being freed, the slave remained a client of the master for life, with yet another special set of duties and rights governing his new status. A dramatic modern illustration of the same sort of legal device at work, I call it category law, because it relegates similar entities to different legal categories, was a famous early 19th century Canadian case concerning a slave named Solomon Mosby. He was an American black runaway who had stolen his master's horse, and he managed to ride it from Kentucky all the way to Niagara Falls. And once there, he was passionately defended by both black and white supporters against extradition into the hands of his by now demonized American masters, who, to his astonishment and grief, had tracked him all the way to Niagara. So the master got on his own horse and sent his employees after Solomon and found him in Niagara. The grounds of his defense were, listen to this, that as a legal non-person, he was not able to steal. And so you can't charge me with theft if I'm not a person. Governor Francis Bondhead, his name was Bondhead, it's an odd name, but he was the governor of the area I live in then. He sidestepped this interesting legal argument without attempting to defeat it by ruling in favor of the extradition of the slave on the practical grounds that he didn't want Canada to become a sanctuary for criminals. You can imagine he had a point. I mean, every criminal in the U.S., black criminal in the U.S., could come to Canada and expect to be protected, even from his crime. But the public was morally outraged, for to use a slave as a non-person and then condemn him for a crime as if he were indeed a person was legal trickery. A sizable public riot ensued, during which 2 men were killed, and Mosby happened to escape to England, where he automatically became a free man as soon as he stepped on English soil. But the most profound question remains: what political purpose is served by category law? The unsettling answer is that both ancient and modern democratic regimes stand upon, I would even claim they continue to survive as ideological systems because of a declared right to define certain classes of humans as non-persons. Furthermore, the particular class of humans chosen for relegation to an inferior category is, listen to this, is always instrumental to the maintenance of the dominant political ideology. In other words, if you take away that category law and that definition of a certain classes of people in your democracy as non-persons, the whole system is going to crumble. For the ancients, this legal class was the slave. Back then, the slightest admission before the law that a chattel slave was capable of stealing or committing adultery would have been an acknowledgement of him or her as a free human being, a citizen, and therefore someone with full legal protection against slavery itself. Very dangerous to their system. Such an admission would have brought down the entire slave system, and that is why overly affectionate masters could be punished for daring to consider their slaves in terms that were too human. Cato, for example, ate and drank with his slaves, and his wife actually suckled a few slave children, but he strictly bought and sold them just the same. The political importance of this kind of category law and of the category psychology with its attendant propaganda to the ideological purity of political systems should not be underestimated. The ancients used this to justify mass slavery and tribal massacres. African blacks used it to control other blacks. Americans and South Africans used it to maintain chattel slavery and apartheid. Modern campaigns of genocide, such as those in Cambodia or Africa, have used it and continue to use it in places like Rwanda in attempts to expel or liquidate entire races. And of course, the sophisticated and highly educated Nazi policymakers understood intimately the political necessity of non-personhood. It enabled infanticide. It enabled the killing of the disabled and the extermination of all politically defined undesirables by who? By otherwise moral citizens. In other words, category law transforms human citizen subjects into political objects without rights, or with only subclass rights. And that's for the purpose of sustaining one kind of ideological regime or another. And probably the key message of my entire book, The Trouble with Democracy, is an investigation of how this sustaining of our own ideological regime that we call democracy has been kept up in this way. An argument central to this book, as I say, well, here I'm saying it, is that modern liberal Democrats have embarked on this very same course. And now I want to talk about what I'm pointing my finger at, which we have discussed before, but I want to do it again. Abortion and our slave democracy. What? You're calling Canada, the US, and almost all other democracies slave democracies? Well, you bet. Because the searing modern battle over abortion rights has become a watershed issue in modern secular democracies, though it never was an issue in earlier organic, Christian-rooted form of these same democracies. And for a specific reason. The mother-to-be seeks the unencumbered, egalitarian, democratic right to the sexual and economic freedom of the male, but she cannot have it without absolute control over the fruit of her passions, which would otherwise forge her fetters or chains. Unwilling to admit to killing a human life, she throws her considerable ideological weight into making her unborn child disappear legally in what history will show to be a most radical and pernicious expression of raw democratic rights. And I want to just read to you from Canada's own criminal code. It's a big book. This thing is I can hold it up. You can't see it. It's a 2,000-page book called the Criminal Code of Canada. And the section called number 223 about the unborn child, here's what it says. And when I first read it, I was just shocked that it actually got into legal language. A child, get this, becomes a human being within the meaning of this act or legal act when it has completely proceeded in a living state from the body of its mother. And a person commits homicide when he causes injury to a child before or during its birth, as a result of which the child dies after becoming a human being. This sounds like some kind of recipe for a magic formula to convert a human being, to convert a non-human being into a human being, which takes place upon complete separation of what people call the fetus. I don't call it the fetus. I call it the unborn child. Let's be clear about what it is, folks, you know. And if you want to defend the idea of killing it in the womb, let's hear your argument. But don't make it disappear with abracadabra Latin phrases and things like that. So, at any rate, as I say, unwilling to admit to killing a human life, she throws her considerable ideological weight, 50% of the population, voting weight, ideological weight, into making her unborn child disappear legally. And I just read you the clause that tells you how, in this country anyway. At bottom, this is not a struggle over unborn babies. It has to do with a feverish, near theological defense of what? Of egalitarian democratic ideology, against the counterclaims of human biology. That's the war. The assertion of an unqualified abortion right is in the end a claim against the natural order of humanity and its moral authority, and a protest against the subordination of personal will that this order must always require. Subordination of the personal will of the mother in the first place, but in many cases also of the father. In short, the abortion rights argument, listen up, bears the same urgent relationship to the ideological maintenance of egalitarian democracy as the right to own slaves did to the maintenance of ancient democracy. It's the same thing. Selective non-personhood always supports an argument for class or race or gender superiority. The paradox for most modern liberals is that while they condemn slavery with indignant scorn, they vigorously defend the right to abort with the blind zeal typical of all who simply accept what I call category law without ever questioning it. My dear black friend, whom I told you about earlier, he tells me he thinks women have a right to abortion. And I said, well, I think it's a form of slavery because they made the child into a non-human being, just like they made your ancestors into a non-human being. What do you say to that? And we just keep riding our bikes. He doesn't answer. The most extraordinary truth about this psychological technique is its absolute transparency to those who rely on it to justify their own freedom, a freedom contingent upon the denial of a similar freedom to some other category of human being. Now, modern liberals are simply unable to perceive, like this fellow was, unable to perceive the essential master-slave relationship inherent in the so-called abortion right that they support so adamantly. And they are also unable to see that this moral blindness is a fairly precise correlative of the inability of the ancient slaveholder to see the evil of chattel slavery. The key issue is said to be the conflict between the rights of the individual woman and the rights of the unborn child. But that is to democratize the moral issue. The more pressing conflict is not between the rights of two individuals, but between the expressed right of the woman and the higher right of the community to defend the as yet unexpressed right of an unborn citizen, or of whom you might call the slave in waiting, so to speak. In the pregnant woman's body, both rights are physically and symbolically present. I should say both rights are physically and symbolically resident. But because modern hyperdemocracy has reduced itself to a simplistic struggle between the competitive rights of individuals, in this case the mother against the child, and it repudiates any higher moral authority, the strategy has been to invoke category law to deny the humanity of the most helpless of these two protagonists. Now, this is Plato's metaphor all over again, a master-slave duality in one body. With a difference, however, the inner slave is not a passion, but the fruit of a passion, subsequently and most conveniently transformed into its slave. The irony is that the same woman who thinks of her child as having no right of sanctuary in her womb conceives of herself as a slave to the child and claims a prior right to be free from the rights of the child. If we accept this reasoning, an inescapable conclusion is that modern nations are annually liquidating about 20% of their potential native-born citizens in the name of democratic rights, and that is in order to sustain their own ideological purity. On the surface, this has to do with the lifestyle convenience of men and women, but the real reason is purely ideological. The moment personhood is granted to a slave or an unborn child, it creates an immediate, unwilled obligation for the owner or the mother and the father, thus constraining their freedom. To sustain itself as a political system, then, hyperdemocracy, as I call it, now so radically egalitarian and more so every day, requires the elimination of all sex distinctions and the right to kill the unborn, for the alternative would lead to ideological collapse of the system. Of course, the category of the non-person, in its origins, it was likely a device of war. We kill human objects and not subjects, and it's easier to kill them if they're objects than if they're subjects, and so on, is a legal expression of an even more fundamental insider-outsider moral framework by which humans have historically banded together against who? Against their perceived enemies. The abortion right is a noble-sounding term we use to mask what is in reality a civil war against a certain class of citizens. But it is this very technique that has enabled totalitarian states throughout history to jail their own citizens as internal enemies, gas and burn them, starve or work them to death, or quietly liquidate them. What's the real difference, after all, between a gas chamber and an abortuary? Nicer lighting, maybe, better mannered technicians who earn better pay, but not much else. The unborn child, subject to its mother's and or its father's will to kill, is an internal enemy, so to speak. You see, I'll say it again. It's an internal, because it's in the country, internal enemy because it's in the mother, enemy, so to speak. So the mother sees herself as enslaved to biology and circumstance or fate, while the baby is a slave to her body and her will. It's the image of that kind of Russian doll you may have seen, with one doll inside the other, an expression of the old hierarchical concept of subsidiary slavery. Now we're going to end with a page called The Political Necessity for Substitute Judgment. This exclusionary strategy, which I've just talked about, is of profound ideological and economic importance to what? To the modern welfare state, the democratic welfare state, because non-personhood leads directly to the need for so-called substitute judgment, whereby an official of the state or some other licensed professional may make crucial decisions concerning the education, treatment, medication, life, or killing by euthanasia of the designated non-person. Of course, abortion has often been termed, I think quite rightly, simply as pediatric euthanasia. Instead of killing you when you're old and incapable and sick or whatever, we kill you before you get born. So it's called pediatric euthanasia. So non-personhood and the strategy of substitute judgment it specifically enables are essential to every political system as a means to avoid the powerful counter-arguments presented by nature itself to ideology. Nature calls the mother to her task, while ideology calls her away from it, to the army or to the office. Nature says all human beings are unique. Egalitarian democratic ideology tries to make them the same, because more and more aspects of private life are governed publicly in welfare democracies. Everything must ultimately be placed in a budgetary competition for scarce resources, and ideological coherence cannot be sustained unless these key spending decisions are taken from private hands and controlled centrally by the state. This means that whole classes of citizens may fall into the category of the non-person, on whose behalf the state will exercise its judgment to balance its budgets. For example, in basic economic terms, the argument for aborting the non-person child is overwhelming. It is simply far cheaper to spend public dollars to abort a single mother's baby at a cost of about $400 than to provide her with 5 years of single mother welfare maintenance that would otherwise likely be required at a cost of, say, $10,000 or $15,000 a year. There are other examples, but rather than allow the ideological crumbling of a publicly funded service such as universal Medicare, the state forces desperate citizens to wait months for treatment. We were just talking about that. Many worsen and die as a result. There was an article in our national newspaper last week about how wait times for medical care in Canada are the worst now than they've ever been, and that something like 27,000 people, by the estimates of the Fraser Institute in Vancouver, which is a terrific economic think tank, 27,000 people died waiting for surgeries that they couldn't get in a timely fashion. It just took too long. So they died in the corridor or whatever at home, waiting to be treated. I have known people in Canada where it is illegal to contract for many kinds of private medical care. For example, we are not allowed to do a contract with a doctor for anything that's on the public list. If you do that, the doctor can be fined $25,000 or have his license revoked. Okay, I have known people, as I say, who pleaded to pay from their own pockets, but they were denied and they died. Substitute judgment was invoked by an anonymous public official to deny them life. After all, the introduction of a mandatory queue or lineup for public medical service is just a refusal of treatment disguised as fairness to everyone. In this way, too, welfare democracies quietly sacrifice their own citizens to sustain their ideological purity. That's a tough sentence, but I mean every word of it. That's what's going on. They must sustain their ideological purity, or a lot of the policies and laws that they create are simply indefensible. The situation is the same with the old and the infirm. From economic desperation, the state will openly or covertly characterize increasing numbers of the infirm and the frail as being in need of substitute judgment under a so-called euthanasia policy, which in Canada we now call MAID, M-A-I-D. Talk about a euphemism. MAID is a euphemism that stands for medical assistance in dying. But it's not assistance, it's actual killing by a licensed physician. See, MAID is where the doctor gets to give you an injection to make you sleepy, and then he gives you a second injection to kill you. You don't do it to yourself. He does it. So he's actually killing you, and the state has licensed him and given him that right to do it. And that's why I say to my friends, if you're going to the hospital, like I am next week, even if only for an overnight or so, I said, when the nurse brings the orange juice, ask her to drink some of it first to make sure you're safe. The situation is the same, as I say, with the old and the infirm. For economic desperation, the state will openly or covertly categorize increasing numbers of the infirm and the frail as being in need of substitute judgment under the euthanasia policy. At that very moment, the sick become unofficial non-persons. This is the prototype for all budgetary warfare inside the hyper-democratic state. And it has to do with slavery in the chilling sense that no one is more a slave or a victim of the state than someone who is first legally defined as, or simply treated as, a non-person and then handed over to the government for final disposal. So there you go. That's my take on the whole situation in that book. I hope some of you will maybe think about getting a hold of that book. There's a lot more in it, but you can find it in a used book website like Abe Books, ABE Books. They have a lot of used books. They'll ship it to you, probably at a pretty decent price. And you may even find it in some Amazon sites. I don't know. But if you excuse the flagrant self-promotion, I think it's my best book and the one in which I've exerted myself to think the most deeply that I can about what's actually going on in our modern democratic polities and to speak about it in the most clear way I possibly could. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, and I'm lucky. I have the book. You sent it to me.
So yes,
thank you very much. I really appreciate that. So William, thank you very much for the lecture. It was insightful and very knowledgeable as usual. I will definitely listen to it again because I continue to have some technical problems which are not interfering with the recording, but it's interfering with my listening. So I wish you great success on the 19th, and I will contact you on the 20th to make sure that you're okay and that you're strong again.
Thank you very much. And I haven't yet sent you the text for the last episode, but I'll write that and send it to you. And I think you were going to send me part 2.
I sent it to you already. I sent you already.
Maybe I missed it. But I haven't written you a text for that either, which I will do.
Thank you very much. I will look forward to that.
Okay. And
thank you, Mr. Gairdner. It was great as always, and I wish we could have you every day, you know.
It's my honor to be here with you, and I think of you all as my long-distance friends. Thanks for listening.
Thank you. It was our pleasure.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much.